Welcome to today's Explainer. So let's just dive right into this. Did you know the average American spends almost 10% of their income on insurance premiums? Now, most of us just set it on auto pay, grit our teeth, and totally forget about it. We think of it as this boring, financial safety net, right? Something we buy just in case. But what if I told you that the research we're looking at today reveals it to be one of the most powerful yet completely hidden architectures shaping our entire society? What if insurance isn't actually about protection at all? The absolutely fascinating source material we're exploring today suggests exactly that. It proposes that under modern capitalism, insurance operates way less like a collective safety net and much more like a system of governance, a system of discipline, really. The authors describe it as this dual system, one that aggressively shields the powerful from accountability while simultaneously policing the rest of us through algorithms and premiums. So here's the roadmap for our explainer today. First, we'll look at the roots of solidarity. Second, maritime trade and empire. Third, the ultimate corporate shield. Fourth, actuarial control and discipline. And finally, number 5, the transition from fraud to force. Let's get right to it.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the roots of solidarity.
To really understand where we are today, we kind of have to look back because insurance actually started with deeply ethical, communal foundations. Historically, it was all about mutual aid. We're talking medieval merchant guilds, early burial societies, agrarian communities pulling their resources together just in case a crop failed. Risk was viewed as a collective exposure. It was rooted in genuine solidarity. But as insurance got absorbed into early capitalist enterprise, it morphed into profit-seeking actuarial calculation. The insured were no longer members of a community protecting each other. Instead, they were turned into isolated, individual, risk-bearing units to be priced for maximum profit. So how did this massive shift happen?
That brings us to Section 2, maritime trade and empire. Modern insurance didn't just pop up out of thin air. It was literally born from the logistical demands of empire. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, European commercial expansion brought massive financial risks. Piracy, shipwreck, war, extremely long voyages. To manage all this, we see institutional milestones popping up, like the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609, which actually helped fund the Dutch East India Company. And then, late 17th century, Lloyd's Coffee House in London becomes this buzzing clearinghouse for imperial risk. Underwriters would literally write their names under a voyage's description, which is where the term comes from, to take on the risk in exchange for a premium. What this did was completely revolutionary. It took the incredible violence of colonial extraction, plunder, and the slave trade and turned it into an abstracted, tradable, profitable risk.
The crucial point here is captured perfectly in this quote from the text. Insurance solved this problem not by reducing risk, but by socializing it upward through contract while privatizing profit downward. Take a second to really think about that. The wealthy investors in London or Amsterdam, they didn't have to face the physical dangers or the moral consequences of their destructive overseas ventures. The system didn't stop dangerous exploits. The researchers point out it actually enabled them. It ensured that catastrophic losses were absorbed collectively through contracts while the massive financial returns went right into private pockets. Which leads us straight into Section 3, the ultimate corporate shield. So let's look at how this centuries-old maritime logic evolved into modern corporate operations. We really need to understand this core concept, moral hazard. Basically, this is defined as insulating decision-makers from the consequences of their actions, which, naturally, encourages greater risk-taking. When a corporation knows its losses are going to be covered or socialized, but its gains remain entirely private, there's a massive incentive to take reckless chances. The source material argues that insurance essentially supercharges this moral hazard. It functions as an infrastructure of externalization for the ultra-wealthy. You can see how this plays out perfectly right here. When corporations engage in activities causing ecological destruction, insurance treats it simply as a calculable exposure. It just becomes another line item on a spreadsheet for them. And what about toxic pollution? The researchers note that long-term costs are quietly shifted onto insurers, the state, or the actual affected communities themselves, perfectly protecting the corporate balance sheet. And with mass harm claims, insurers step in as this procedural buffer. They delay, they litigate, they cap payouts until claimants are just completely exhausted of their resources. We're looking at this data impartially, but the authors paint a really stark picture. Liability policies don't prevent social or environmental costs. They just turn them into a financial instrument so corporations can avoid accountability. Moving on to Section 4, actuarial control and discipline. Well, this system acts as a shield for the top.
The authors argue it's simultaneously turned downward to police everyday individuals like you and me. The source makes a really striking argument here. Creditworthiness has become a proxy for citizenship. That's a huge concept. In modern society, your right to participate, your access to housing, employment, transportation, utilities, even basic life necessities, isn't just a given right anymore. It's earned statistically. A numerical credit score or a risk profile now completely dictates your social mobility. And unlike the legal system where you get a trial, this discipline happens automatically, relentlessly, and honestly, often invisible.
And this brings up a phenomenon the text calls algorithmic redlining. The researchers describe this as laundering discrimination through opaque proprietary code. Digital systems use statistical praxes, things like your zip code, your consumption patterns, behavioral data, to predict your risk. And because these algorithms are legally shielded as corporate trade secrets, they operate like a black box. If you're denied an apartment or an insurance policy, there is rarely a human you can actually appeal to. Accountability just kind of dissolves into math. The source describes this as preemptive discipline. You're excluded not for what you've actually done, but for what a computer model statistically predicts you might do. In this system, insurance actually functions as a privatized regulator. Premiums actively steer your individual behavior. Think about telematics tracking how hard you hit the brakes in your car, or health apps monitoring your daily steps. Everyday life becomes this continuous audit, where privacy is just a luxury good for those who can afford not to be tracked. And, maybe most importantly, structural vulnerability gets treated as an actuarial burden. A missed medical bill, or living in a neighborhood that's suffered from historical disinvestment, the system doesn't view that as a structural failure. Actually, scratch that, it's worse. The algorithm translates it into a personal moral judgment. Probability literally replaces justice. And finally, Section 5, from fraud to force. So what happens when these statistical systems of exclusion reach their absolute limits? The source material lays out a pretty chilling pipeline, detailing the transition from administrative actuarial fraud to the use of actual physical force. An administrative insurance lapse, or a credit denial, creates this invisible bureaucratic barrier. That barrier directly leads to eviction, homelessness, or severe economic exclusion. And that inevitably brings us right to policing, incarceration, and state force. The authors argue that risk governance doesn't eliminate physical force at all. It prepares the ground for it. It ensures that by the time overt physical coercion arrives at someone's door, that individual has already been statistically sorted, priced out, and deemed unworthy by the system. So we have to confront the reality presented in this research. Risk has really become capitalism's preferred grammar of control. It's the quiet successor to overt physical force, governing populations softly through numbers, premiums, and scores, while seamlessly insulating the most powerful from the consequences of their actions. So I'll leave you with this provocative question to chew on. If our obedience and our access to society are now engineered almost entirely through spreadsheets and algorithms, how do we begin to reclaim our citizenship from the calculus of risk? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helped you see the everyday world just a little differently, and I'll catch you next time.